Hey there, this is Atul from Team K21 Academy, and in this video, we are going to look at how to deploy a real application cluster or RAC on Oracle Cloud. But first, if you're a complete beginner, then let's understand what is RAC. If you're a DBA, you probably already know. On a very simple layman's term, you have in a real application cluster, you have two or more machines. So in this case, if you see here, you have RAC node 1 and RAC node 2. Node here or machines or virtual machines, I'm going to use word interchangeably. So you have a database running on multiple nodes or more than one node, and then underlying data is stored in a shared disk which both the machines can access. And on that disks or on those servers or on that file system, you have cluster file system. So both machines or all multiple machines can write to the same database without or same data without corrupting the data. So that's a concept of a real application cluster. And that real application cluster can be deployed on cloud, but there are some limitations on that. So as we saw in one of the previous lessons, you have multiple options for deploying RAC, normal databases on cloud. You have bare metal, you have virtual machines, you have Exadata, which could be Exadata Cloud Customer or Exadata Cloud Services. Now, if you're deploying Exadata Cloud Customer or Exadata Cloud Services, Exadata by default automatically comes with RAC where you have minimum two node or you can extend up to multiple nodes. I think there are 32 depending on whether it's Exadata Cloud Service or Exadata Cloud Customer. You can extend multiple machines. So by default, that comes with RAC. Now coming to this virtual machine, this is where you can configure max two node RAC. If you're deploying bare metal doesn't support a RAC. And if you want to deploy a RAC on a high performance machine, then that's where you are going to deploy public cloud or Exadata Cloud Service or Exadata Cloud Customer. Otherwise, you deploy them on virtual machine DB system. And that's what we are going to look at in this hands-on lab. So if you notice, I've already logged into the Oracle Cloud account. If you have not yet created an account or have not looked in how this console looks like, there's already a video available on the portal for you. So make sure that you watch them if you're not familiar with how to create a free trial account in Oracle Cloud or also how this navigation looks like. So watch that before you come or pause this and watch that video first. Now, this is where you have, in order for you to create a RAC database on VMDB, you will going to go on to this hamburger menu here. And this is where you will see all the databases as we saw in earlier in navigation menu. So you click on Oracle databases here. And this is what I was talking about earlier. There are different type of databases. And this is where you have bare metal, virtual machine, and Exadatas or Exadata. This is Exadata Cloud Customer. So as I said earlier, you can only create a RAC either on a virtual machine DB system or Exadata's Exadata Cloud Customer or Exadata Cloud Service. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to do it on VM. You can't do a RAC on bare metal. So just click on this here. And first, an important thing is you'll be creating a DB system. And while we create a DB system, I'm going to show you how to create that RAC. So make sure that you're in the right region and then also then come to this DB system and click on create a DB system. So first of all, you'll be selecting the compartment. Now, also again, we covered earlier, compartment is a logical collection of your resources so that you can assign right permissions. By default, when you create, you get an account, you get a root compartment, which will be also your tenancy. So just to explain a little bit better, I've already created a compartment called CMP database, and that's where I'm going to create this database. You can create them under root as well, but to show you how this compartment looks like, or what, or how to deploy it in a more enterprise world, I'm sharing it and doing it on compartment database or CMP database, which I've already created this compartment earlier from the compartment screen, create compartment screen, but you can use root compartment. Now, this is where you are naming your database. So I'll say DB or RAC DB, and I'll probably put a Atul name. And then this is where you select availability domain. Because I'm in London region, I'm going to pick availability domain 1. if depending on your region, you might see just one availability domain, not three availability domain. Now, this is where you select, you've looked in, select the shape. So I'm selecting the virtual machine, not Exadata or bare metal. Now, this is where you see on this, the Linux machines on which my database is going to run. I'm selecting that shape, like how many CPUs, how many memory. We'll leave it to the default. If you change, I think minimum you need is 4 OCPUs to run RAC per machine. But you can play it and see if you want to change the shape, if you want to increase the memory or CPU, you can change it here. Now, this is where you're configuring storage. And then for grid infrastructure. So my Oracle RAC needs something called grid infrastructure, and we'll create a grid Oracle home grid instance. Again, these are DBA concepts. Probably you might already be familiar or will learn or understand that your Oracle database home or Oracle database will need underlying grid for cluster to work properly. So this is for storage for grid. You can change this storage if required. Now this is will dictate whether it's a single node rack, single node machine or single node database or a rack. And this is where you'll be selecting it two node. And that's if you see max, you can only do two. Now, if I selected one, this is where you have the software additions. Now there are different additions and addition will dictate what all services or what all features you can get in database depending on the edition, and standard edition, enterprise edition, high performance, extreme performance. For rack to work or for rack you need extreme performance and your licensing cost increases accordingly. So we'll be selecting here two node and it automatically picked up extreme performance. Total storage if already picked up based on the grid infrastructure and other database requirements. Based on the shape or storage you picked it here. So you wanted, because we wanted 256 GB available storage, and that's why I picked up automatically the total storage. This is where you can give optionally your rack cluster name. I'll leave it blank. This is where you do define your SSH keys. So you can either upload your own SSH keys or you can generate SSH keys. And these SSH keys will be used to connect to these virtual machines on Oracle databases, VMDB system, bare metal DB system, or Exadata Cloud Service. You have access to these virtual machines and you can connect to these as the user OPC, and then you can also switch to root user. You have full access to these machines, and you as a DBA or cloud DBA will be patching and maintaining these virtual machines on which your RAC databases or single node databases are deployed. So I'm saying save this private key and also save public key. So I'll put it in my download folder and then save public key as well. And later when I'm going to connect to these databases, I'll be needing these keys or I'll be using this private key to connect to these database machines through PuTTY. Scroll down and this is where you'll be selecting the license type. You can, within the cloud software, you can say license are included, which means it will cost as you use your Oracle RAC database or Oracle database on cloud, your license will be charged or you'll be charged for license as well. Or if you've already purchased license on on-premise, you can use that license for bring your own license or BY as a BYOL. So I'm saying I already have a license. I'm going to use BYOL, or you can say license included depending on your situation. So I'll say license included. Now, this is important for, as we covered in one of the previous networking module, where you can deploy the databases either in a public subnet or private subnet. So I'm not going to go into the networking concepts again because we've covered it in networking module in detail, but just wanted to show you that your database can be a different compartment and your network can be in different compartment. And it's one of the good practices to have networks in a separate compartment, database in separate compartment. So your DBAs will have the DBA compartment access to manage, whereas your network team will have the network team compartment. So I've already created my network, which is a VCN, which is a network, and then subnet, my machines gets created in the subnet. So I'll need to provide where this network is or VCN is and where that subnet is. Again, if you're not familiar with these concepts, I'll highly recommend you to go back to the networking module and refer that networking module. So here I've created a another compartment called CMP network. And in that networking compartment, I've already created a network called VCN manual. So if you're not familiar, maybe go and we've covered, as I said earlier, follow that networking module and refer there. Now, here I'm going to select again, so this is my network or VCN, and then I'm going to use my subnet in order to find out again, subnet is in the same network compartment, and there are two subnets are available in this. Again, when we cover Exadata, I'm going to cover that Exadata separately. In that, you need two networks. One is for client connection and second is for backup connection. And I'm not going to I don't want to complicate it right now. For now, just assume that my customers will or my applications need to connect to this database and they will need IPs, scan address, and these machines also need these IP addresses. So all those IP addresses for scan listeners, for my machines will be getting it from the subnet. So I'm picking this one subnet which I've created already on this network. Now, network security group, this is kind of a firewall which will be applicable at a IP level. There's another firewall which is called a security list, which you can define at a subnet level, but it's always a good practice to use network security group. These days, it's also recommended approach to do a firewall. You can use either of them. So we'll use I'm not selecting it right now here, but you can use later. You can also add it later for your databases. We'll leave it blank for now. This is here you can do your host name. So you'll say RAC DB01 or whatever host name you want to do, and it will automatically update the domain name. And the domain name is picked up from the this is your subnet DNS name and then your VCN DNS name. Again, don't worry right now if you don't understand. We'll explain them in the networking module. Scroll down, and this is where you can see more advanced options. Now, again, we covered what is a availability domain and fault domain in one of the previous modules, or in fact, I think in the module 1. And here you can select the fault domains. And fault domain is nothing but a separate physical rack machines on which your virtual machines are deployed. Now, because we are doing a two-node machine or two-node rack, it's always good to deploy them in a separate fault domain. RAC, if you leave it blank, Oracle will automatically deploy these RAC instances in one single availability domain, but in the two different fault domains. So you'll be picking a fault domain 1 and then fault domain either 2 or 3, one of them, because you can't deploy um, both the RAC machines on the same fault domain. Or it's not a good practice. So here we'll select fault domain 1 or 2. If you can leave it blank as well, and Oracle will automatically update it here. And then you select time zone, which will be configured on these virtual machines. Then click on next, or you can also select tags. Again, I'm not going to go into tags. We've covered this in depth in our OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Architect program. In that, we'll give a quick intro here. It's a name value key pair using which you can do some budgeting or pricing, and you can also do some security as well based on the tags. For now, we'll leave it blank. Click on next, and this is where your DB name is. So I'll say RAC DB01. You can also put a unique DB name, or it will automatically assign it the unique DB name. And then this is where you select whether you want a 19C database or 12C database or 11G database. So I'll select for now, leave it to 19C, otherwise you can select these databases. Or you can also bring your own database software image. So you can create maybe for example, a specific database version, and you can create that database software image. We'll cover that separately. So I'm going to use the images that are provided by Oracle and 19C version of that. This is where you can give a PDB name, pluggable database. If you're again familiar with the database concepts and multi-tenant architecture, you have a PDB and CDB. So you'll be selecting here PDB name. Now this is where you provide sys password, and sys password is again to have the database access. Now again, I'm going to use just a domain password. I don't use these in my places or any other place. Now also, You need a TD, which is transparent data encryption. So all the data which is written to the disks or database writes, it's stored or it's encrypted using TD, and then the keys are stored in the wallet. So this is the wallet password. We are saying, yes, use this TD wallet. This is where we looked into the single node when we're deploying single node VMDB system. Also, you can either use transaction processing or a data warehouse. What is the type of database, whether it's a OLTP or data warehouse? So we'll see transaction processing. You can also configure backups, automatic backups, or we can do these later as well. And this is where you see all the advanced options, like what kind of a character set. This is a database character set. To encrypt the data, you want Oracle managed keys, or you want to configure your own keys as well. And tags, we already looked into the tags for this database. And this is where you will click on create a DB system. Now, because I'm in a trial account doesn't allow to have two OCPUs, or you will have to request the increase limit. So we'll click on here, create DB system, and I think I probably should be getting a error. So it says that the following service limits were exceeded. So I'm hitting a limit, which what I'm going to do is I'm going to request an increase limit, and then I'll proceed with the same. So how to request the limit increase? You can go and search here limits. And then this is where you see limits and quotas. Again, we have a separate video which talks about limits and quotas. So maybe refer that to how to request the limits increase. But for now, I'll request the increase limit, or I'll go on our paid account and then I'll create this account, and I'll show you once it's created, how does a RAC DB system looks like. Well, while we wait for this database to be created, I would like to invite you for a approximately 90-minute free class on how to transition from Oracle DBA to Cloud DBA, including Exadata Cloud Service, Exadata Cloud Customer, and MySQL databases. Now let's back on to the database. It should have been created by now. Now, once your database or RAC database is created, you will come to a page which will show like the DBS, which is database or DB systems, which will be showing all the details about this database that you've created. So in here, that will give you generic information or general information, things like the lifecycle state, whether this DB is available or not available, in which availability domain or in which region that's created, that you can see on top right here, in which availability domain that's being created, what the shape of these virtual machines that you have created on which your RAC database is created. Also, what is the CPU core count, and all the other details. What's important is that in which VCN, virtual cloud network or network it's created, what is the client subnet through which client user IDs will be connecting. Also, basically, the scan listener, which is highlighted here, scan is where the single client access network, if you're coming from a database background, you probably know about already this, how the address of this and the three IPs behind that scan listener, which are being picked up from the subnet that we selected earlier or network. Now, network security group, as I said earlier, is for firewall at the IP level, these scan IP addresses level. So that will dictate who can access. You can protect or you can configure security rule saying who's allowed. If you don't configure anything at a network security group level or a subnet level, which we call something called as security list, which is applied at a subnet level, then you won't be able to connect to this database. So important thing is from whatever is your client side address from which your application is connecting or you are connecting as a SQL net, those should be open across network security group or security list. Again, if you're not familiar with those things, we have a networking module in which we have already covered this, or you'll be seeing in the networking module difference between NSG and security list and how to create, and not only creation, but also attaching this onto this particular database. Or if it's a network security group, you'll be attaching to the database, which is on VIPs. And then if it's a security list, you'll be applying them on a subnet on which this database is created, in this case, sn-atul-client. Scroll down. This is where you'll see the database version. And what is the database patch set available, you will be able to see it here. What's important to note here is that this will show you nodes, which means the two virtual machines on which it's your database or on which RAC database is running. So two nodes, these are Atul RAC DB1 and Atul RAC DB2. And this is where it will show you under what fault domain these two virtual machines are running. If you want, because right now I've stopped it, but you can start them by clicking here and then say start machine. This is how you start the the virtual machines. You have access on these virtual machines. If you want to connect to these virtual machines, you can also connect it through SSH or PuTTY, and these are the IP addresses you'll be connecting to. This is the private IP addresses because we have created them into a private subnet. If you create them into public subnet, you will have the public IP as well. Now, because I've created them into private IP only from machines within this VCN or network I can connect, or I have to do something called as a best-in service, which we have covered separately in, if you're part of OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, in where we've covered best-in service. You can use best-in service to connect to a machine which is in private IP. Now, this is where you can do the console connections if you want to connect through the backend. If these SSH doesn't work or the VMs are not coming up, you can use console connections. This is where you will have the database. This is a database name. Now, important thing to note is that VMDB system, virtual machine DB system, can only run one database, whereas bare metal DB system can run multiple databases, or Exadata can run multiple databases. But then as I said earlier at the start of this video, the bare metal DB system can't run RAC. If you want both a RAC as well as multiple databases on same hardware, then you'll be using Exadata Cloud Services. Now, other operations you can do, which we'll be going to cover in our respective administration module. This is where you can go and scale up storage. You want to add storage depending on, because we have used RAC, we are using Oracle Grid Infrastructure. If you're using a standalone databases, you can configure underlying storage as logical volume manager LVMs, but Grid is more preferred. And Grid is mandatory for RAC databases. This is the performance. Again, if you've used boot volumes, you probably are already familiar. The storage underlying, you can do a higher performance or balanced depending on what kind of app database, or if you need high throughput, then you probably might want to configure these storage for a high performance at the start itself. And this is where you'll be increasing the storage for your data, for recovery and total space. Then this is where you can change shape of these virtual machines. Right now we are running with 4 CPUs, 64 GB RAM. This is where you can change these if you want. This is where you can clone. As the name suggests, you can clone this database to another RAC database. This is where you can add additional SSH keys. These SSH keys will be used to connect to these SSH keys will be used to connect to these virtual machines. And then from here, you can do more administration operations, like you can move this database system to another compartment, or you can update the license type. That's now possible. And then add tags. And finally, terminate, because if you're not using this, you can terminate. And eventually, this is what I'm going to do because I'm using my trial account. And once trial account is, I want to make sure that we don't get charged because I'm using this environment for a demo purpose. So I'll click on terminate. And then I need to type the name of the DB, which is db-atul. And finally, you say terminate the DB system, and this will go and terminate. So be careful, you can terminate this database. Now, you can also configure something called as IAM policies, again, covered in OCI in depth. There's something called as IAM policy that you can attach to a compartment and then attach that policy to a group and saying that, hey, if this policy holder can't delete the database, they can only create it, but they can't create it. But these are some of the advanced things which I'm talking about. So don't worry if you're not familiar with that. That's more about identity and access management. So now it's terminating, and eventually after some time it will terminate. So just to do a quick recap on what we have covered, you can configure a real application cluster or RAC database on Oracle Cloud, but you have the options for you have is then you can only configure them in either virtual machine DB system, or by default they come as a RAC database on Exadata Cloud Service or Exadata Cloud Customer. You can't configure them on bare metal DB system. So that's in a nutshell about how to create and also manage your Oracle RAC database on a virtual machine DB system. Now, if you have come so far, make sure that you go into WhatsApp group and inform that you have completed this video. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. We might add some additional questions based on the questions we get. So in future, we might add some more bonus question answer section around this virtual machine DB system RAC database. Well, that's a video taken from our training program on how to transition from an Oracle DBA to Cloud DBA, including a database cloud service, Exadata Cloud Service, Exadata Cloud Customer, and MySQL databases. This is a complete 8-week program going from complete beginner onto Oracle Cloud to knowing everything that an Oracle Cloud DBA know, including Exadata Cloud Service, Exadata Cloud Customer, including certifications and preparation for the job. Now, if you want to know more about this, I would like to invite you for a approximately 90-minute free class where you learn how to transition from Oracle DBA to Cloud DBA or Oracle Cloud DBA, including certifications. It's complete free, where we'll be learning things like what are the database Exadata deployment options on cloud, like Exadata Cloud Customer or Exadata Cloud Service. We'll also look at database deployment on virtual machines or bare metal we call database cloud service, including deployment options on Oracle Cloud, things like deploying in single region or and single availability domain, or single region but multiple availability domains, or deploying databases on multi-region across regions, including RAC and standby databases. You'll also learn how Exadata Cloud at Customer is different from Exadata Cloud Service deployment. We'll also do a quick demo on how to provision your first database on Oracle Cloud. And once you've provisioned it, how do you access the IP address, get access to the entire server, virtual machine, and access the databases as well as you do in on-premise world. I'll also briefly talk about the two certifications we highly recommend for Oracle DBAs in cloud and how to get hold of these certifications quickly. I'll also be talking about the 15 plus hands-on lab that you must be performing to not only clear the certification, but the most important is get a job as Oracle Cloud DBA, covering things like patching, cloning, backup and restore, including both Exadata Cloud Service, Exadata Cloud at Customer, as well as autonomous databases and MySQL database. I'll also be talking about this 8-week roadmap to go from complete beginner to get certified as well as get a job in Oracle as Oracle Cloud DBA. So if you're interested, go to this URL k21academy.com/cloud DBA 02 one word and select the date convenient to you, enter your name, email address, and click on save my free seat. And we always get excellent feedback on this free class. With that, this is Atul from Team K21 Academy, and I'll see you in another video.